All right, 3 minutes should be good. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. It's really awesome to see all of you. My name is Declan Ingham, and I am a research associate at A Path for Europe, an independent nonprofit think tank based in Berlin. PfEU works with young professionals, researchers, and both PhD and master students to conduct research and develop policy advice on issues relevant to the future of Europe. And I would like to extend a special thank you to the team at PfEU for making this event possible, especially the behind-the-scenes work of Naomi Burchett and Annette Zonback. So today we'll be discussing carbon pricing and its distributional effects with Vlad Surdea. Vlad is a policy consultant based in Berlin and has worked on projects with many civil society and public sector partners, including E3 Analytics in Berlin, the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources in Jordan, and the Energy Policy Group in Bucharest. He is currently pursuing his Master of Public Policy at the Hertie School and holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of Bucharest in Romania, as well as certificates from Sciences Po and the University of Amsterdam in the field of energy policy. And his upcoming thesis models and explores normative questions surrounding the distributional effects of carbon pricing in Romania and Bulgaria. So before we begin, let me just say, if you have any questions, please write them in the chat or save them till the end. You can put your hand up with the React feature, and I will call on you to speak. And welcome, Vlad. Nice to see you today.
Thank you for the kind words, Declan. Nice seeing you here, and looking forward for our interesting conversation.
Perfect. Let's just dive in then. Maybe we could start with, what is carbon pricing? How is Europe currently pricing carbon? And what makes it such an attractive proposition, keeping in mind the question of who it is attractive to?
Sure. So carbon pricing is a very general term that refers to a set of policies that mainly tries to link the pollutions, the pollution made by certain firms or certain individuals to the actual emitter by imposing a mandatory price. So for example, if a steel producing company emits carbon in the process of creating steel, then through carbon pricing, we force that firm, that steel producer, to actually pay for the emissions. The theoretical concept that underpins carbon pricing is the idea of a negative externality. So basically, the atmosphere is held in common. It's something that we all hold together. We're all affected by greenhouse gases accumulating in the atmosphere. So when one firm or one individual decides to undertake some economic activities that result in greenhouse gases, it affects all of us. But the costs of actually producing those gases are not immediately felt by the producer. So we try to make the producer feel the costs, the social costs of carbon emissions. And this is basically the carbon pricing 101. Why is it attractive? I think there are many reasons for which it is attractive, and I will dive straight forward to the idea of carbon pricing in the European Union, like you stated. Currently in the European Union, we have a homogeneous system of pricing carbon, the European Union's emissions trading system. Basically, companies from a large number of sectors that are emitting carbon and other gases as well, basically greenhouse gases, are forced to buy certificates proportionally numbered to the tons of CO2 and other greenhouse gases that they are emitting during 1 year. So basically, this forces companies not to pay a tax directly, but it's the same cost that is incurred by the companies through the system of allowances that are tradable. Of course, companies can trade these allowances. If one company doesn't actually emit as much as they have bought allowances in the past, they can use them in the future. And if they need more allowances, they can buy them on the free market from other firms or from governments or from actually a plethora of sources in the European Union. The European Union, I think, decided to go with this system because it's easy to achieve a political consensus and political coherence when trying to achieve an ambitious climate policy through carbon pricing. Because climate policy in the past has been mostly viewed as a progressive stance in politics. Usually social democratic, progressive parties have been the ones that have supported, and of course, green parties supporting any form of climate action. However, because carbon pricing is a market mechanism, because it's very flexible, and because it involves a large revenue stream that governments can spend afterwards, it was fairly easy to convince conservative parties, liberal parties, social democratic parties that we can all benefit from instituting a carbon tax. It was a long battle, and the European Commission has done wonders in the beginning, convincing governments to introduce this type of policy. But nowadays, I think nobody really opposes the EU ETS. Maybe only very ambitious climate policy makers or activists, people that would like more ambitious policies. But other than that, the main advantage of climate policy is its flexibility. It can help diverse groups that act as diverse electoral pools for diverse parties. Yeah,
it's really fascinating that it offers such an option to triangulate and cross this cleavage in the sense that it offers so much to different constituencies.
exactly.
And so then what is the perceived problem with carbon pricing in your research? And so how do we go about fixing this problem that you identify?
So previously, I've stated that it's almost unanimously accepted that carbon pricing is an effective manner of combating climate change to a certain degree, and it's also politically feasible. However, carbon pricing has one major issue, one major barrier in the face of implementing a more strong carbon pricing regime in Europe and in different countries. Namely, carbon pricing usually affects the least well-off in society more than it affects the other. And it's a simple consequence of the fact that people from lower income groups in society, poorer people, the least affluent in the society, usually live a more carbon intensive lifestyle. They don't have fancy electric cars. They don't plant trees constantly so that they can compensate for their emissions. And they do not live a vegan diet, eat based on a vegan diet that's not really carbon intensive. So no, poor people don't have that many options to avoid emitting carbon and other types of greenhouse gases. Therefore, when the carbon tax would be calculated, it's usually based on how much people emit, how much people and companies emit. It means that people emitting more have to pay more. And usually, it's not unanimous, but usually it is the case. People that are poorer are emitting more carbon, so therefore they need to pay more as part of the newly instituted carbon tax regime. So this means that carbon taxation has strong distributional concerns. And this is the main problem, because parties, usually smaller parties that oppose climate action in general, try to frame carbon pricing as something that the elites push in opposition to the poor people that will have to bear the costs for what the richer people have done in the past. And there's a grain of truth in that. However, it's not something that we cannot control. And I think this is important to note.
I was surprised by that finding in your research that lower income folks and lower income people were such high emitters, in the sense that I think there's a belief sometimes that higher income people are just consuming so much more resources through their lifestyle, through travel, just through their consumption patterns. Yeah, and so I was surprised to see it be as regressive as it was.
It is surprising, and maybe in rich, affluent countries in Western Europe or the United States or Canada, these things are more moderate. Like there's indeed a class of very rich people that owns private jets and has a very fancy lifestyle. They are very carbon intensive indeed. But for
These were the people I had in mind.
Yeah, yeah. But the majority of people in the world actually do not live on average a very carbon intensive lifestyle. So therefore, you need to remember that you're always compared to the average. So it's not like a carbon price or any form of carbon taxation law in a country would just replicate carbon taxation from another country. It's always regional, it's always local, it's always national. And when you go at a national level, if your richer people are poorer than the people in the West, you shouldn't expect them to also be as high emitters of carbon as people in the West. So no, it might be surprising, but overall research has confirmed at many points in time that poor people tend to live much more intensive lifestyles in terms of their emissions of carbon. Yeah.
And so, I mean, I think there's an intuitive sense of injustice to this idea, but maybe you can kind of expand on why we should care so much about whether the tax is regressive or progressive. Because if it solves climate change, it solves climate change. Shouldn't a reduction in GHG emissions be enough, and we'll just have to deal with the consequences?
So I think there are two pillars of a discussion here. So first and foremost, I think there's a deontological injustice at the foundation of this discussion, because in the past, it's not like poor people were the one that have driven industrialization and globalization and other large-scale phenomenon that have made us reach this point of no return of overcoming tipping points in Earth's climate system. So historically speaking, poor people are not at fault for what's happening right now, or not at much at fault for what's happening right now. But putting this aside, I think you're right. If it solves climate change, it solves climate change. However, if you want to solve climate change, you need policies that are functional now and are functional in 5 years and remain functional in 50 years. So this means that we're not allowed to only implement policies that are vastly unpopular and they resist for the duration of one government's mandate for like 4 years or 5 years. And then we have a populist party that rides on a wave of anti-green policies and browns the entire policy spectrum in the country, destroys every form of carbon pricing and other climate policies. So it's important to think on the long term. And I think this is a cliche, but nevertheless, this is a marathon, it's not a sprint. We cannot achieve everything right now. We need to make steps. It's not always about being incremental, but it's always about being at least incremental. We cannot go back on our promises. So carbon pricing is important. It's a tool in our arsenal against climate change. However, it's not sufficient, maybe, and we cannot risk to destroy the general population's trust in climate policy and ambitious climate policy just because we didn't account for the distributional consequences of this particular policy.
So how do we then account for those distributional concerns? What is the response to lower income people carrying a disproportionate share of the burden due to their carbon intensive lifestyle, due to whether the fact they have to keep their homes more, need some more of their budget, etc.?
So I think the first thing that needs to be pointed out for people thinking about this being not only a distributional concern issue is that every policy has a distributional aspect, especially taxes, mostly because when you introduce a tax in a country, there's a new revenue stream that's generated for that government, right? Mm-hmm. Always. So it's a question about what you're going to do with the money. It's not a question if you will do something with the money or if you won't do something with the money. The government won't keep a stash of dollars just because they introduced a new carbon tax. So money will flow to the government. And the question is, what specific social policies should then complement carbon pricing? And this is an entire debate. It's a debate in and of itself. But there are two strains of thinking. One strain of thinking says that we should actually give the money back to the people, because as I've stated in the beginning, we're all trustees of the atmosphere, that it's a resource we hold in common. And therefore, this is a dividend for us, the owners of the atmosphere, and the other environmental amenities, right? And there's a second strain of thought that states, look, if we have introduced a tax that's distortive by nature, because—
I believe the internet is cut out for just a second. I don't know if it— it seems my internet connection has been a little bit unstable. Just give me 2 seconds.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, okay, it seemed to have stabilized. Sorry about that. Sorry for interrupting everyone.
Yeah, I think you were not a fan of me talking about replacing the already existing taxes. So the internet tried to help you with this.
I think my internet was trying to cut out the tax cuts that you were pitching there. But no, I'm sorry for interrupting it. So I'll let you proceed.
Yeah, but this is true. There are many people that believe if we introduce a new tax, we could already eliminate other taxes that distort work directly, that distort labor, that distort capital. And because carbon taxation usually induces a significant income stream for the government, this could potentially result in significant reductions of other taxes. So these are mainly the two instruments with which we can alleviate the distributional concerns of carbon pricing. Yeah.
I'm going to assume you mentioned the revenue recycling in the form of transfers during that moment that I was unable to hear.
So yeah, we call them transfers in general. It's transfers, dividends, or just giving people
Dividends,
money, right? Yeah, this is the first thing that you can do. You have money and you give it back to the people. You transfer the money back to the individuals that have emitted carbon in the first place, because this is part of the discussion.
And so this revenue recycling in the form of transfers sounds
Yeah.
pretty appealing in response to the just transition problem and the sort of moral and distributional justice question you referred to earlier, in terms of achieving reductions while still protecting the least well off from negative effects that they're powerless to really, or they're not really responsible for. But do you think it repeals to all the constituency at play? The legislators afraid of making hard decisions, lower income voters who are effectively getting taxed and then getting a check in the mail at a later date, sort of middle class constituents who care about the environment, but I don't know, like that's more making progress on that issue is much more amenable to them than say social justice, business concerns as well. Like, does it respond to all these constituencies' concerns?
I'm not sure if this particular revenue recycling scheme in the form of a transfer responds to all the concerns of different constituents. However, what I think is absolutely necessary is that when a government introduces a carbon tax or an emission trading scheme, any form of carbon pricing, they need to also come up with a very comprehensive communication strategy that addresses the diverse opinions and the diverse concerns of different constituents in different manners. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all way of making sure that all the people will agree with the introduction of a carbon tax. However, I think this is a way in which you can make sure that people that are the most affected by the introduction of the carbon tax become aware of the fact that carbon pricing can function without them being sacrificed, because the green transition needs to be a just transition. And I think this is the message that we want to send to poor people in the society. Going then to the middle class, I'm not sure if the middle class is always so vindictive. Like they want to support climate policy, but they will necessarily oppose any form of social transfers that would compensate for the distributional concerns of climate action in general. However, if this is the case, there are many ways in which you can frame the transfers so that they don't perceive it as being just another form of welfare. For example, and this is a discussion that's currently being held in Central and Eastern Europe, many governments try to appease different categories of people by framing transfers and any form of revenue redistribution from climate action as being a response to energy poverty. Energy poverty meaning that people cannot afford with ease to access energy sources constantly, electricity, gas, different other forms of energy. And many people are affected by energy poverty, even if not so hard. Even people that we might consider rich have sometimes issues like energy poverty. And if a government comes and says, look, this is a carbon tax, we will introduce it, but it will augment currently existing concerns related to energy poverty, and we will introduce these transfers specifically to solve the problems that we have introduced, then it's much more easy for people to understand and comply with the idea of the carbon tax. But as stated initially, we always need to target as narrowly as possible these groups. Narrowly tailored approaches are essential in introducing climate policy.
So explicitly making sure that the right people get these checks that are compensated, that would be the people who would be disproportionately bearing the cost.
Of course.
So this question, I think, that I'm also trying to get at is, are we sacrificing anything by trying to bridge the gap between social and environmental concerns? Like, are we weakening our environmental policy by doing this? Like through I don't know if we use the word Pigovian tax yet, but the point is that it's a tax to modify someone's behavior. Does giving a check back afterwards diminish the environmental ambition of the policy? And vice versa, does making it a social transfer program distort the original intent?
So the short answer is maybe. We never know until we actually introduce a tax and ex post we analyze what's been happening. But let me speculate a little bit.
Absolutely, go right ahead.
First, it might reduce somehow the overall effectiveness and efficiency of the Pigovian taxation, right? It might not straightforwardly modify the behavior of people. For example, people that use biofuels for heating, which is a very carbon intensive way of providing the necessary heat, might not immediately change their lifestyle. However, I think it's important to point out that many of these people cannot change their lifestyle immediately, especially people in poor areas, remote areas, rural areas. Those people cannot just change their entire lifestyle overnight because they don't have the revenue to do so. So I think it's important to know that while yes, a carbon pricing with a specific redistribution in the form of a transfer that targets poor people might indeed reduce the effectiveness of the initial carbon tax, this might be a good thing because it might force people to adapt, but on a longer term. And this is more feasible for them. So you're not forced to completely sell all your fleet of very old diesel cars, but you might think of doing this when you're buying your next car. You might think into buying a hybrid car. So it's more about the long term, as I've stated before. And I think combining climate policy with social policy forces people to think, it forces people to change their behavior, but it also allows them to make these behavioral changes indirectly and on a longer term.
Yeah, I think about my people in rural settings who, can't exactly switch immediately on whether they want to buy an electric vehicle or whether they'd like to take a bus or rail that does not exist to get from point A to point B.
Exactly.
They can't commute if they don't have a vehicle, so they're not able to make the change. But I think you're right to say that over the long term, it would give them a sort of object, or it would raise the salience of this issue when they're making future purchasing decisions.
Exactly. It's about the salience. And just one more point here. If we actually want to analyze the behavioral changes of individuals, it's not like people are fully rational. And when you introduce a carbon tax, they will see the rise in the prices, but they will also integrate the fact that they might receive a certain check if they're under a threshold, and they will make a complex financial calculation and deduce their taxes and very complex things that people just don't do. When you see that the price of electricity goes up, the first instinct is for you to reduce your electricity consumption. Maybe you won't reduce it that much after 3 years when you see that you have received the check, but on the short term, the immediate response, the natural response, is to do something because your incentive structure has changed.
Yeah, I like that use of the word incentive structure, but still, you might not turn the TV on for as long, but it's unlikely that they're going to audit their entire electricity system upon first noticing the price signal. So we've talked a lot about the equity question as a function of income, which is a vertical equity. But maybe you could speak to questions of horizontal equity. Like, are there other forms of equity that we're missing or not paying attention to by focusing purely on income because of the virtue of designing the program as a transfer? Like gender, race, individual responsibility for emissions, employment, and region would be all sorts of other forms of equity. Are we missing anything by focusing on transfers?
We're missing a lot if we're not actually looking as well as at the horizontal distributional effects. And let me make this distinction very clear. So by vertical distributional effects, we refer to the effects a carbon tax might have between different income groups, poor people versus rich people. While when talking about the horizontal effects, we refer to the different effects that the carbon tax might have across regions, across genders, across age groups. And yes, I think this is very important, especially in the last case. And this is one of the main points of my latest research piece. I've studied how carbon taxation actually is distributed across regions. I've studied the case of Romania and Bulgaria because they're closer to home. And there are indeed large discrepancies between how different regions are affected by the introduction of a carbon tax. Certain regions that are more carbon intensive, for example, regions in which there's a lot of coal extraction that's being done, are likely to be highly affected by the introduction of the carbon tax because it's not only individuals that are affected, it's also large firms, large companies that are the main employers in specific regions. And if we only look across income deciles and income groups at the vertical distributional effects, we might miss the fact that many of the poor people that are mostly affected by the introduction of a carbon tax in the absence of transfer live literally in the same place. They live close to each other. And this is particularly important when we're getting back to the question of political backlash, because it's not like a political party that opposes climate action would have to go across the nation from village to village to gather support. They'll just need to go to the most affected region, to the region in which coal is extracted in the country, and they will see there hundreds of thousands of people that were directly affected and for whom the transfers are not sufficient because they do not account how intense the switch has been for that particular region.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting question on this is that, we can transfer the income, but the employment is a whole other side of this. As people lose their jobs, you can't transfer someone out of a regional economy unless you do sort of relocation subsidies, but those are incredibly invasive procedure. They're not exactly ideal to start moving people around based on changing their incentives to move via transfers. Yeah, and sticking with this question of like the politics of it, are you ever worried about the high visibility of carbon prices in the sense that heating taxes and heating bills means the policy has to become far too punitive to become effective, and that it will then become politically unfeasible?
I think it depends. For example, the price of carbon in the EU ETS is usually it's paid by the firms because they are the ones that have to acquire certificates. Of course, the costs that they incur are passed through to the individual, to the population. So ultimately, it's always the population that has to bear the costs. But indeed, sometimes the tax might be too salient. For example, if you actually look at your heating bill and you see that 10% of that heating bill comes from buying green certificates on the market because you need to fulfill the carbon tax, that might be problematic. So it's indeed problematic that you need to trade off salience sometimes with effectiveness. You want the tax to be perceived as important because you want to change behavior, but you don't want the tax to be perceived as being intrusive, as being there when it was not there the last month, and last month it was better, because that's how you create frustration, that's how you create tension, and that's how you accumulate opposition towards climate action. However, I think governments can be smart enough. It's not like carbon pricing will be introduced starting from next year. We have experience, like decades of experience with designing carbon taxation, with making sure that people are informed about it, because it's not like we want to keep it a secret and people just see higher prices for energy. We want them to know, but we want them to be informed. We want them to acknowledge the necessity of the carbon price without them fearing the fact that the prices will just rise constantly because of this green elitist measure that has been introduced.
Yeah, it's kind of a hard thing to balance. In my home province, one of the oppositions to green policies came from a conservative party that began slapping stickers on gas station pumps, informing them that these elitist, liberal, big city politicians decided to impose this tax, and they're directly paying for it at the pump. And it was quite an effective backlash. And I believe the carbon pricing regime actually fell shortly after. But speaking of this imposition question, I want to shift over to Eastern Europe a little bit, because I know your research focuses on that, and I think you'll have a really cool perspective. Because I wanted to ask about the Europeanization of carbon pricing. So I think you previously talked about thinking about policy and politics from place and location, and I wanted to ask about the view of Romania and Bulgaria, positive and negative to carbon pricing, and also whether carbon pricing in this way can be seen as a sort of unwarranted or unwise imposition from Brussels, or is it a necessary pressure?
So I think both in the case of Romania and Bulgaria, the authorities are unlikely to introduce climate policies by themselves. Like the authorities in Romania and Bulgaria are not climate ambitious.
Sorry to hear that.
That's the reality. However, when there's an imposition from Brussels, they just implement them. So it's not really a hard-fought battle against implementing climate action. Or you might try to change some nuances that favor your country, and that's normal. That's the realpolitik. That's never going to change. However, whenever something was decided at Brussels, both Romania and Bulgaria diligently introduced the policies. And this was the case with the EU ETS. The EU ETS is functioning right now in both countries. It's functioning well for what it was intended to function, like it didn't change dramatically the landscape in either country, but it reduced emissions across both nations, and that's a plus. That's the main objective of the EU ETS. However, it's indeed problematic that because both Romania and Bulgaria have started looking at Brussels for climate policy, and they haven't educated the audiences at home, the population has never been informed properly on why climate policy is being designed, why it's being implemented, and how to evaluate it yourself. There's no pressure coming from the population to actually introduce new measures, to actually be more aggressive in the fight against climate change. And I'm not necessarily saying about large-scale movements, because that's not realistic, but even the number of NGOs and think tanks focusing on energy policy concerns and climate policy concerns is not that high compared with other countries. It's improving, and it's not like nobody's there, but because there was a Europeanization of climate action in general, both Romania and Bulgaria avoid discussing this. This is basically a taboo thing. It's a technocratic issue. People just implement it, they design it, they evaluate it, but nobody's really talking about it. If you would go down the street, people will know about the majority of the taxes they pay. They'll have no clue that this EU ETS system is in place and that they are ultimately affected by it. And this has some positives and this has some negatives. I think the positives on the short term is that people are not really coalescing against it. However, on the long term, people won't push for more. And current authorities have proven to be very unambitious. So we need for somebody to push forward.
It's interesting in a way. It sort of it released some pressure for the domestic political system that there wasn't this movement internally because of the Europeanization to push the governments individually, but that has led to a more durable, if not less visible, policy outcome. That's an interesting point. I'm going to open up to the floor for questions. I haven't seen the chat yet, but if anyone has any questions, I certainly have a few left over. If you'd like to just raise your hands or post them in the chat, I can read them out. Yeah. I see you have a question from Oliver. Who determines the price and how is it calculated? And considering the European-wide internal market, there's an EU-wide carbon price/tax or price/carbon tax for individuals. Is it not discriminating nationalities as well? Being rich in Romania or Bulgaria is maybe different to being rich in the Netherlands or Sweden. I would argue that it's cheaper to live a carbon excessive lifestyle for people from those countries then. I mean, you can read the question as well, Vlad, in the chat. But
yeah, I was just reading it. So the price is determined on the market, actually. In the case of the EU ETS, there are some emission allowances that are given for free by the authorities to certain companies that have been deemed too important to let them fail. And I think this is a completely other debate, but also a very important debate on carbon leakage. Basically, if you increase too much the price of carbon in a certain place, companies will just move in other jurisdictions where there's no carbon price, and then they will emit even more than they would have emitted initially, therefore making a worse situation overall. This is the issue of carbon leakage. So many allowances are issued annually and given for free to different companies. However, there's a limited number of allowances that's been offered freely, and the rest of the allowances have to be bought on the market, where the price is being achieved, like you achieve the price through market mechanisms. Basically, it's about the supply and the demand of allowances. How much carbon has been emitted, how many allowances are there on the market. That's why the price has varied dramatically. It's been so low for almost a decade. Like the price of carbon was almost non-existent in the entire European Union. However, for the last years, the price has been steadily increasing. It's not where it should theoretically be for us to avoid a climate disaster, but it's growing and we're getting there. And regarding the second part of the question, that's true. It's just easier for richer people in Netherlands or Sweden to live the same lifestyle with their income. It's easier for them to do this than it's for rich people from Romania to live the same lifestyle. And just to give a quick example, in my study, I have computed the average the average share of the income paid by different groups in the society. And the richest people in Romania, they indeed pay less than the poorest people in Romania, but they still pay way more as part of their income than people in Germany, all people in Germany actually, or France, or Spain, or the Netherlands. So yeah, that's true. Let me read the second question then, or yeah.
Yeah, I can read it out while you're reading it
Okay,
as well,
great.
so everyone else can hear. How do you think, a question from Jan Albrecht, how do you hear, or how do you think a potential expansion of the EU ETS to the transport sector, i.e. increasing prices at the pump, will affect public perception and political feasibility?
I think there's a funny debate behind the debate on extending the EU ETS to the transport sector. I know for sure that many representatives of the transport sector have pushed for their sector to be integrated in the EU ETS, mostly because the current regime of taxes and penalties is much harsher than the average penalties that would be incurred by companies in the case of the EU ETS. So this is a very tricky and sensitive system it is much more linked to the lobbying activities than it is to actual effective policymaking. However, it's true that in the future, probably we're going to have transport system at least partially integrated in the EU ETS, and people will see the increase in the price at the pump. However, people have constantly seen the increasing prices of gasoline and diesel in the last decade or so. And it's not like it changed the way in which people use their cars so much. It changed, in fact, the way in which people and companies produce cars, like hybrid cars, electric cars. It acted more towards the supply side than the demand side. But that's just speculation. It might be a problem for the future feasibility of carbon pricing in Europe, but I don't think so, because it's the majority of the large companies that produce cars recognize the fact that they will have to change their fleets, the way in which they produce cars. So I personally don't think it will affect the feasibility of carbon pricing.
Yeah, and I imagine that people do have some experience with fuel taxes. I mean, sort of a carbon pricing adjacent policy. So it'll be interesting to see how they respond.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions, or can I jump back to mine? Let's see. I'll see in the chat, or if anyone raises their hand. All right, I'll jump back to another question. I'm curious about connecting it to, returning back to the sort of tax and transfer. We're seeing carbon pricing as sort of a tax and transfer scheme. And you mentioned that I think you mentioned earlier that this has a sort of relationship to a sort of social democratic policy, the idea of a transfer. But seeing how well they're doing, social democratic parties across Europe are either on life support or have already died, or they exist in very particular configurations, the Nordics or Portugal or Spain. But why should we hitch environmentalism and green politics to what feels like a kind of exhausted redistributive political project?
I'm not really sure we need to frame it as such, because indeed, social democracy is not the pillar of European politics that it once was. Mm-hmm. However, what we see is a significant rise, especially in Western countries, of the green parties that are not necessarily social democratic green parties. They sometimes combine conservative liberal green politics with social democratic progressive politics. But it's true that when you talk about social transfers, you talk about an idea that has been promoted for probably almost a century by a certain political movement. But to be honest and to be very frank, I don't think there's any other way. Mm-hmm. So I don't think there's any way in which you can promote climate ambitious policy without resorting to the traditional instruments of social policy, welfare. We discussed that we maybe need to frame it differently, but that's the problem of framing is here since at least the age of Blair, and I think we're doing fine with framing and reframing things. However, yeah, I think it's an absolute necessity, and it also allows different parties to actually push for climate policy without seeming that they're heretics of their own ideology, because carbon pricing can be something without meaning anything in terms of politics. You can have a policy that can be framed as a market instrument if you're a conservative party like CDU, or if you're a social democratic party, you can frame it as being something that addresses a current problem while also promoting welfare benefits for certain targeted population groups. So
But at
it
that
might be a win-win. It might be a
but at that
win-win.
offset moment, you either have to pick a transfer or uh, what you alluded to earlier and what my internet rejected, tax cuts or some sort of other version of a conservative transfer.
Yeah.
Um, so there is a
And
point of decision where green politics either needs to take a path on sort of left or right, so to speak.
there's a point of decision or not, because the majority of governments in the world, or the majority of local authorities that have implemented carbon taxation, don't use the revenues in just one manner. For example, in California, a significant portion of the revenues from their emission trading system goes for social projects, especially in communities that are disadvantaged from historical pollution. Like if you had a power plant in your neighborhood, you're probably going to receive a significant transfer ultimately. But there's also money that's being sent for R&D, for innovation projects, and even for modern green infrastructure. And this is the same model that has been applied discreetly but effectively by the European Union. So you have different ways in which the revenues are being spent. And we were a little bit extreme in saying that it's either transfers or tax reductions. But you can do a lot of things with the revenues generated by carbon taxation. The one thing is that you need to at least think of addressing the social distributional effects. This is one thing you need to do. It's not like you have to spend all the money on this, but at least one portion of the sum should be spent on welfare. And I think this is the point in which centrist politics in Europe especially help, because both the right-wing parties and the left-wing parties agree on some level of welfare measures and social measures. So you can agree on this, and you can achieve a consensus of using 20% for transfers, 40% for R&D, and other investments can be also done. So yeah, it's a choice, but it's not black and white.
Interesting. Are there any concrete examples of revenue recycling that you're particularly intrigued by? You've mentioned the California, but even exactly what is going on at the EU ETS level of what those revenue recycling strategies look like?
I think the problem with the EU ETS recycling is that it's a little bit too complicated. Countries are
Okay.
allowed a lot of discretion in how they actually use the revenues. They have certain thresholds that they need to meet investing in green objectives and so on. But there's a lot of discretion, so it's hard to analyze Europe as a whole. But going back to California, California is a success regarding this, because you actually managed to have a unanimous agreement on introducing and then expanding carbon pricing because different groups, different constituencies were satisfied with the outcome. So I think that's a good objective. And also there are some local emission trading schemes in Japan, Tokyo and Saitama, where there's also there are a lot of manners in which the revenues are being spent, not only on social objectives, but also innovation and infrastructure, and it's diverse. I think that's the point. You'll never see two carbon pricing regimes that look the same, and this proves the fact that this is a flexible policy tool, and flexibility means that you can use it in a variety of contexts.
Definitely a plus for policymakers if they're
Definitely.
able to tailor this policy to whatever context or whatever constraints and demands they currently face. Yeah, I actually didn't know about these local Japanese ETSs. That's very fascinating that they can run an ETS at such a small level.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No. I was just saying it's not maybe not a majority, but a significant number of ETS systems and carbon pricing systems is local, because it's easy to introduce a carbon pricing system in your local constituency where you know what specifically you need to do with the money. Like we've discussed before, when you know that you're a carbon intensive region, you might actually use that money in a particular manner that's very effective for your constituents. So I think that's one of the reasons for which carbon pricing was localized so much, That's why we don't have a global carbon pricing regime, but we have local regimes.
I'll turn to the audience again to see if there's any questions. Just put your hand up, or using the reaction, or just write them in the chat. You can also speak as well to carbon pricing regimes or constraints or politics in your country. That could be something to react to as well, because I'm sure we would both love to hear everyone's views on carbon pricing around the world. No questions, so I think we'll just move on. We're kind of near the end of their time, and I don't mind ending a little bit early because I've gone through my questions. And yeah, do you have any closing remarks or any comments you'd like to make about upcoming work?
Oh,
I think we see one question actually you might want to respond to. Any recommendations for the European Union in the short term? What is good? What can we do better?
I think the EU recognizes there are still problems with its system. That's why it's reformed so much, and it's still reforming. But I think the main problem with the current system, and many people agree on this being a problem, is not necessarily related to the distributional effects of the ETS, but it's related to the fact that there are still too many allowances that are freely given to polluting industries. And this has resulted in the pace of emissions reduction at the European level to be lower than expected, because companies just get every allowance for free, so they don't have any incentive to actually reduce pollution. This was caused, as stated before, because of the fear of carbon leakage, but many studies have proven that carbon leakage is more of a theoretical phenomenon that certain political groups try to use in their discourse, but it's not really there. We cannot see it. Companies are just not moving in other countries, in other jurisdictions. So I think on the short term and on the long term, just reduce the number of freely given allowances and make sure that the pace of reduction is higher. Yeah, I think that's my main recommendation for the European system.
Yeah. Do you have any other closing remarks to add before we depart?
Not really. I think this was a good thing to end with, because ultimately carbon pricing is flexible and we should benefit from this flexibility. Reform the policy, just make it useful for a given period. If it's useful now, maybe it won't be useful in the same way the next year. So just change it. You can change it. It's flexible enough.
Well, perfect. Thank you everyone for joining this conversation. If you're interested in hearing more, you can always like and subscribe to the PfEU social media, and you can hear about upcoming coffee conversations over the next few months. And as well, this video will be uploaded afterwards, and take care and stay safe out there.